we are today being called upon to cast our votes for or against in favor of a new bill on the declaration of assets, whose objective is to provide for the declaration of assets by parliamentarians and holders of important offices in the public sector. In terms of legislation, the issue of declaration of assets in our country has known 4 milestones in the last decades, Madam Speaker. Firstly, in 1985, when for the first time a law on the declaration of assets was passed, and this law was introduced by Sir Anirudh Jagannath, the then Prime Minister of the country. But those days were the heydays of the MMM. In fact, the MMM was the main political force of the opposition and probably of this country in those days. And true it is, in those days, the MMM was forcefully campaigning for the introduction of such a legislation. And with the power and campaigning acumen that this party had at the time, there is no doubt that it succeeded to convince the government of the day to finally introduce such a law. And in 1985, as I said, Sir Anirudh Jagannath, as Prime Minister, came before this House and had the House adopted this legislation. It was a first step in the right direction, Madam Speaker. But this 1985 Act was a very restrictive piece of legislation, principally for 2 reasons. The scope of the law, the definition of assets, as we all know, was very, very restrictive. In fact, assets included only property or shares in the property, shares, or vehicles. Grosso modo, this was the definition of assets in this bill. And worse, the second reason for the restrictive nature of this piece of legislation was that it restricted disclosure also, because the law in 1985 did not impose any obligation on the parliamentarians to disclose their assets. As rightly pointed out, I think, by the Honourable Prime Minister when he introduced it, when he made his speech. The law did not impose the obligation, the burden on all of us to declare our assets, but gave the parliamentarians the choice, the option of whether they wish to declare their assets publicly or not, whether they were agreeable, they consented to have their assets declared publicly. And some members of the House at that time took advantage of this provision and did not declare their assets publicly. And I was listening to Honorable Gayan. He said that the then leader of the opposition, the leader of the MMM, who was then the leader of the opposition, described that law as an eyewash. This was perhaps the reason of his comment. Then, in 1991, came the second milestone. The 1985 Act was repealed under the Prime Ministership of Sir Anirudh Jagannath, and came the other, and was voted the second Declaration of Assets Act. This law was enacted, and this enactment cleared the situation with regard to disclosure, and brought, therefore, some improvement. It imposed the obligation on members to declare their assets. Otherwise, it did not propose anything new with respect to the restrictive definition of assets. The definition of assets stayed the same in the law of 1985. Then, the third milestone was in 2002, when the MSM-MMM government was in power. The POCA was adopted, Prevention of Corruption Act, by the House. Another issue now cropped up with regard to the declaration of assets, which issue was to have a considerable impact on the question of declaration of assets. What happened, Madam Speaker? Section 88(2) of the Prevention of Corruption Act amended the Declarations of Assets Act and provided as follows. This is what is in the law. On receipt of a declaration under Section 304, the Commission, meaning the ICAC, shall, in accordance with such directions as the Speaker may give, cause such declaration to be laid before the Assembly. This proviso of the law created havoc, and I will explain how. Therefore, in the 2002 Act, which the MSM-MMM government passed, the member of the National Assembly or the Roderick Regional Assembly, which had already come into existence by that time, had to deposit with the ICAC a declaration of his assets and those of his spouse, his minor children and grandchildren to the Commission. And it would be the Commission and not the clerk of the Assembly as it was before who would cause such declaration to be laid before the National Assembly. Now, since this amendment of the Declarations of Assets Act by the POCA in 2002, I understand that the then Speaker did not deem it appropriate to issue any directions under Section 5 of the POCA Act. The new amended Section 5 of the Act gave rise to a confusing situation and to different interpretations. Most of us can go back to the PQs put by the former Prime Minister at that time, and we will be appraised of this state of confusion as answered in these PQs by the different answers given by the Prime Minister at that time. In a PQ, it was said that the legal advisor of ICAC interpretation was that the Commission should await the directions of the Speaker before causing the declaration to be laid before the National Assembly, and that the absence of such a direction from Mr. Speaker, in the absence of such a direction, he could not cause such a declaration to be laid before the Assembly. To cut the story short, Madam Speaker, since the law was amended in 2002, ICAC never sent any declaration of assets which was deposited with them to Mr. Speaker due to the supposedly ambiguous provision which gave rise to different interpretation of the law. Therefore, what had to be done, and which was never done, was the clarification of the law by bringing the necessary amendments. But unfortunately, the state of the law was never clarified, and the confusion stayed with us. Then, the fourth milestone came the amendment of 2011. This amendment was, the Prime Minister used the word sneaked in, but this amendment was in fact brought into by way of the Local Government Act of 2011. This act contained many clauses, 200, I can't remember, but at the end of this bill, I can't remember which clause it was, which section it was. This particular clause amended the Declaration of Assets Act and did away with the necessity of a public declaration of assets. And this clause in the Local Government Act, therefore, repealed the operative section in Section 5 in our Declaration of Assets Act with regard to the publication of Declaration of Assets. Therefore, as we stand today, there is no need for MPs to publicly declare their assets, and this is why, as I said, the present piece of legislation is a definitely a breakthrough, a major step in the right direction. Because I have personally followed this particular issue for a long time, Madam Speaker. I have myself raised several questions in the House in the past. Last time, I asked supplementary to the Honourable Prime Minister about the public, whether the assets will have to be declared publicly, and he left a doubt. I don't know whether he did it deliberately because he knew what was going to be in the law, but he left a doubt as to whether the assets will have to be declared publicly or not. Because let us get one thing clear. You can declare your assets with the clerk, with the speaker, with ICAC, and this declaration of assets can be shelved somewhere in a drawer somewhere. But there's a difference between that and having the declaration of assets which you have made by way of an affidavit be rendered, be made public. This is the two difference, the major difference. And now, of course, it is a good thing that this law has come to clear the situation, to improve the situation, and to render the declaration of MPs and other public officials public, subject, of course, to certain exceptions to which I will come in a few minutes. So this is why I say, Madam Speaker, I have followed this dossier. I have raised several questions on the issue, together with other friends in the opposition. And opposition now, and an opposition before, when the Labour government was in power. I must repeat, I have no quarrel with the bill. It is un grand pas en avant. It has clarified this hazy situation. It has plugged the different loopholes which existed in our law, which apparently existed. Things being clear now, this law will set the stage for a healthier situation with regard to the declaration of assets issue, which in fact deals with transparency in public life. My honourable friend Fowler, Mr. Fowler, started in the first line of his speech saying that this is a law concerning corruption. He is right. Corruption, anti-corruption measures, transparency in public life, la probité, l'intégrité, la transparence dans la vie publique are all related to what we are speaking today, Madam Speaker. We are dealing, in fact, with the question of intégrité de la vie publique, ways to discourage corruption, and the promotion of good governance. And this law is now a widespread, this philosophy of having elected representatives declare their assets and accountable to their electorate, to their public, to their population, is a widespread phenomenon. Somebody said it before me, I think it was Honorable Duval. More than 100 countries now have such type of regime. And the law has evolved in the past 40 years, Madam Speaker. The mentality also has evolved. Different countries have different type of legislation. In the UK, I remember, there is no law in the UK. There is a register of assets where all the MPs have to come and declare their assets in this register, which is public to everybody, which is available and accessible to everybody. I remember when I was in UK at that time, because this register was set up in 1974, those were the days when I was a student in UK, there was a British MP who was called, again, the older among us will remember him, was called Enoch Powell. He was a rightist guy, right, to the extreme right, conservative. And when you looked at him, you could see that he was a conservative fellow. the way he looked. And with his mimi, like Honorable Ratna usually wears. So this man said, I will not comply with any necessity of declaring my assets. What do they think? I'm a thief? And he was, of course, a clean guy with unimpeachable past and the typical orthodox conservative in those days, and he refused. He said, do whatever you want. Sanction me as you want. I will not, because there is no doubt. Why should I accept that doubt be cast upon me when I go and I have to declare my assets? You think I've stolen my assets, and so on and so forth. So he refused. This was a different mentality. And I think someone said it before me, when we are asking MPs to declare their assets, true it is, we are not saying, we are not casting an aspersion on politicians. But things have evolved now as they are. We owe this duty of accountability to our electorate, to those who have elected us. And I personally think there is absolutely no problem in having MPs declaring their assets. Therefore, this legislation, as I said, Madam Speaker, to me, the most positive aspect of this legislation is that it gives a wider definition of assets, which is more in keeping with the present-day situation. Assets, as I just said, were strictly defined in the past legislation. It covered only movable property or any interest therein, shares or any interest in a partnership, société or company, and thirdly, motor vehicle and boats. But the bill before the House defined assets in a wider manner, and we can see that there are no less than 8 definitions of assets, Madam Speaker. The ambit, therefore, has been widened, and so much the better. By widening the definition of assets, Madam Speaker, by spreading its ambit, as I just said, by so doing, this law is reinforcing public confidence and public trust in the will of the political class to promote good governance and favor this culture of integrity, which is badly needed in our country. This question of widening the definition of assets was raised a few times during question time in the past, Madam Speaker. Many of us, we asked the Honourable Prime Minister, if I'm not mistaken, the previous Prime Minister, Minister Mento, or even the former Prime Minister, it is time to revisit the definition of assets and to come with a new legislation. And I personally, I raised this matter on the 2011 in a supplementary. This is the gist of my question. The Honourable Prime Minister just talked about the advisability of reviewing the law. The Declaration of Assets defines the word assets, but this dates back to 85. But now, with the passage of time, with a new financial situation, with the evolution in financial matters, doesn't the Prime Minister think that we should review the definition of assets and widen it so that it can include promissory notes, other derivatives, gold, or other new instruments? And I thank the Honourable Prime Minister and Government for having taken this definition on board and widened, in fact, with the other definitions that are to be seen in the law. But I would like, and these are my reservations, these are the points I would like to make. I would like to ask the Honourable Prime Minister whether we should not have included 2 other definitions, which are included in other jurisdictions. The first one, Madam Speaker, is the question of securities. Now, should we not have included in the definition of assets investment-linked products, such as life insurance and other related products? Madam Speaker, as I said, the situation has evolved today. The definitions of assets should have included other investment products, such as insurance policies or assets held directly by the public officer or his related parties, or indirectly through structures, special purpose vehicles such as partnership trust, international business companies outside the countries held by nominees. We have to define related parties. Related parties does not mean only blood relation, but also business links with somebody. I say that, Madam Speaker, because we have a Securities Act in our law. And there is the law, the Securities Act of 2005, I think, yes, Act 22 of 2005, which defines securities, which means shares or stock in the share capital of a company, whether incorporated in Mauritius or elsewhere, debentures, debenture stock, loan stock, bonds, convertible bonds, or other similar instruments, rights, warrants, options, or interest in respect of securities mentioned in paragraph A and B, treasury bills, loan stock, bonds, and other instruments creating or acknowledging indebtedness, shares in securities of or rights to participate in a collective investment scheme, depository receipts or similar instruments, or options, futures, forwards, and other derivatives, whether on securities or commodities, any other transferable securities, interests, or assets as may be approved by the Commission, and any such other instrument as may be prescribed. It starts with A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, Madam Speaker. So a wide definition. The word securities is defined in the Securities Act. And I wonder whether we should not have broadened, although securities is mentioned in the law, but define the word securities, Madam Speaker. Therefore, this is the first point I wanted to make with regard to the definition of the word assets. A second point I would like to make. I think we should also have imposed the obligation on parliamentarians in this House to declare the remuneration or the gratuities they receive from the professional activities when performed at the request of public bodies and statutory corporations or private companies funded by the state. I think there should be transparency also on that. Professionals, law practitioners, or otherwise, who receive remuneration or gratuities when performing their professional activities after having, of course, made a contract or at the request of government bodies, I'm saying, of course, not private firms or private companies, public bodies, statutory corporation, or private companies funded by state, whatever remuneration or fees they receive should have been declared in this declaration of assets. I think it is the duty of elected representatives of this House to declare in the declaration of assets the fees they receive from these public bodies when the services have been retained by the latter. Another question I would like to ask the Honourable Prime Minister is that why in this present law liabilities has been removed. In the law of 85, 91, 2002, everywhere we can see, Madam Speaker, I have in a copy of the Declarations of Assets Act now, the present one. Every member of the National Assembly, Regional Assembly, and so on and so forth, will as the case may be, will deposit with the Commission, the clerk of the Rodrigue Assembly, and so on, a declaration of assets and liabilities in relation to himself. That was the case in 85, in 91, and 2002. Now, I think Honorable Gayan said, I forgot to, there is the general perception that politicians volent. Somebody said that before me. Yes, this is the perception. But then, if we purchase a property and we have borrowed the loan from any other, from a bank or financial institution, to show that how did the parliamentarian purchase that property, this was the purpose, I think, of having the word liabilities in the 3 previous legislations, which has been removed in this law. So I think it should have been clear, Madam Speaker. The other thing I wanted to say.
Honorable Ganu, yes, I think what you are mentioning about the declaration of liabilities is in section 3, subsection 2.
Section 4, yeah. But I am saying, Madam Speaker, that the application of the Act should have, right at the beginning, should have made it clear, and not only when he makes the declaration. It's a drafting. So, Madam Speaker, the leader, I think the other point I wanted to make was with regard to Section 3 of the application of the Act. It relates to the return concerning the fresh declaration. If we can have a look at that section, fresh declaration, we see that in that clause, a category of public officials, or whatever we call them, that is the chief executive of the municipal council, the city council or the district council, are not placed in the same category as MPs. And I think that Section 6A should have included also Section 3(1)(f). Section 6A, Madam Speaker, talks about every person in Section 3(1)A, 3(1)B, 3(1)C, 3(1)D, and then we omit EF, we go to GH, shall within 30 days inform ICAC in writing when he acquires or disposes of any freehold and so on. But Section 3E and F, persons under 3E and F, they make a fresh declaration with ICAC every 5 years. What I'm saying is I don't see why Section 3E, Madam Speaker, that is Section 3F, I'm sorry, Chief Executive of a municipal city council, municipal town council, or district council, or every officer of such council drawing salary, why they should have been put in the same category of a judicial officer or any senior public officer. I think we should have displaced them from that category and lumped them with Section 3ABC, which means that the chief executive of the municipal city council or district council should have been made to inform ICAC within 30 days when he acquires or disposes of any property or motor vehicle. There is another point I would like to make, Madam Speaker, regarding Section 7. Let us look at Section 7, and the question was raised by Honourable Leader of the MMM, whether ICAC shall not, in relation to the person, shall disclose to the public. Section 7(1), ICAC shall disclose to the public the declarations made by members of the Assembly and so on. How was this disclosure to be made? Nothing is spelled out in the law. I think, Madam Speaker, I have gone through the different legislation in other countries, and I think I have found what is the answer to that solution, to that question. The answer is that ICAC should publish in the Gazette, probably, the declarations that are deposited with him and which ICAC is entitled to disclose publicly. So this would be the right way, and perhaps it should have been inserted in the law, as it is the case in other countries. Madam Speaker, I have seen it in some other jurisdiction that the publication in the Gazette, once the declaration is deposited, is the formula with which this declaration of assets is made public. Madam Speaker, this is my last point regarding assets, and I would like to ask the Honourable Prime Minister, with regard, if I have understood Section 7 correctly, disclosure of declaration. Therefore, what I understand is that ICAC will not disclose to the public money in any currency in local banks and foreign banks. Any item of jewelry, precious stone or stone metal or watch exceeding 500,000 rupees, or cash in hand and so on, not exceeding 1 million rupees. ICAC will disclose everything else publicly. ICAC will disclose, therefore, all the other definition of assets publicly, money, cash in shares and freehold or leasehold property and so on, except for money in local banks and foreign banks, except for the jewelry exceeding 500,000 rupees, except cash in hand not exceeding 1 million rupees. Madam Speaker, I think this particular provisos, sections 7(2), reading as follows: ICAC shall not, in relation to the person referred to in subsection 1, disclose to the public information pertaining to money in currency in local banks and foreign banks. I think there is a discrepancy between what we find in this provision and what is to be found in other provisions of the law. What does that mean? It means that if a member of parliament, if an elected representative, or if a public official to which this law applies now, owns a property of 2 million, 3 million, a small apartment, a small flat somewhere, so therefore he will have to declare this property because it is defined as asset to the ICAC, who will publicly, who will disclose to the public the declaration that this person owns such and such property, not worth more than 4 or 5 million. And whereas if another person of the same category, be a politician or an official, has in his local bank, I don't know, 500 million rupees, 1 billion rupees, it means that in that case he will be spared from declaring that money which he owns in local banks and foreign banks. I said it earlier, declaration of assets is not casting an aspersion on somebody. It doesn't mean that that person must have stolen the assets he has, that he possesses now, but to discriminate in terms of assets, that is, imposing the obligation on somebody who owns a small property, a car, a small car, he has to declare that publicly, whereas if he owns a big sum of money in any currency in local banks, he is spared from disclosing. ICAC is allowed not to disclose that for public information. I see that as a paradox in that law, as a contradiction, and I would like the Honourable Prime Minister to explain why we have this particular provision in our law. Madam Speaker, I said earlier that we are debating today not only the question of declaration of assets by parliamentarians and public officers, we are in a wider sense dealing with the question of integrity and probity in public life. The this piece of legislation is only one tool in the endeavor to combat corruption. I think it is only one tool. It is only one way of combating corruption, of promoting the culture of integrity. But I think we should also reflect, Madam Speaker, on the advisability and urgency in parallel of promulgating a code of ethics for members of the National Assembly, and reflect on the advisability of amending our standing orders for the setting up of a commission of ethics or a parliamentary commissioner on ethics has obtained in other Westminster jurisdictions. I think one tool is not enough. The present legislation is a good thing. I have said it a few times since the beginning of my speech, but on its own, I think it should be accompanied by other measures, one being a code of ethics for members of the National Assembly, just in the case of public officers and officials, Madam Speaker. A special code of conduct in the case of public officers and officials. A special code of conduct of ethics for our public officers should have been put in place. At one time, I know there was a code of ethics for public officers in this country. I don't know whether it's still being used and whether it is still operative. I don't know, and of course, it has never been given effect of law, and I think we should also, as in other countries, Madam Speaker, I would not like to take the time of the House. I have with me a law in Kenya where there is a law called the Public Officer Ethics Act of 2003, which regulates the question of ethics of public officers by providing a code of conduct and ethics for public officers and requiring financial declaration from certain public officers and providing for connected purposes. Last but not least, Madam Speaker, I think we should have a code of conduct also for our advisors, because advisors are recruited, are paid from public funds, and I think they are left to operate in a vacuum. I think the government can ponder, can reflect upon the necessity of drafting also a code of conduct for advisors so that we can avoid problems from time to time which we hear with certain advisors, Madam Speaker. What I mean to say in arguing this question of code of conduct, Madam Speaker, is that it is imperative to declare one's asset. Certainly, it is a positive measure, but we must also build up the proper setting, the climate to promote and to improve the conditions for a better ethos and integrity culture among all politicians, public officials, and also public officers. Madam Speaker, having said that, I wish to also draw the attention of the Honourable Prime Minister about the last issue which I want to raise. It's with regard to the question of credibility and effectiveness of the instrument, of the mechanism which you are putting in place in this piece of legislation. Some before me on this side of the House have denounced the credibility of the ICAC, have clearly and unambiguously expressed their doubt with regard to ICAC as the right mechanism to monitor this whole question of the declaration of assets. The question remains often as to the extent, Madam Speaker, and this is from the report, the surveys, the analysis that have been made by experts in that matter. The question remains open as to the extent to which the disclosed information is an accurate representation of the wealth and the income of those declaring the assets. We are debating this issue, Madam Speaker, because we need the mechanism, the effective mechanism for the verification of the truthfulness of the statements, which is vital to the whole process, to the whole credibility of this process. How much false information, how much unverifiable data will there be, Madam Speaker? How deep, how far will the monitoring and the verification exercise be carried out? And how, as I said, how productive will the exercise, this mechanism, take place? Research has shown, Madam Speaker, that countries with a long tradition of officials' assets declaration, I mean MPs or public officials, where there is a long tradition of declaration of assets, has significantly lower corruption than countries who have recently adopted new laws. Studies have shown that the perception of corruption was lower in countries whose declaration laws forced members of the government or anti-corruption bodies, members of government to declare their assets, and anti-corruption bodies be given all the means to query and prosecute the offending official. That research has shown also, Madam Speaker, that countries that verify regularly the official statements had significantly lower corruption than countries that did not verify the declaration content and are happy just to accept the declaration made without any verification. And finally, that countries that allowed public access to official assets declaration had significantly lower corruption. Because I think the reason for that is clear, Madam Speaker. Why do countries that allow wholesale public access to the assets of officials, of MPs, of parliamentarians had significantly lower corruption? Because l'exemple vient d'en haut, and this is why, therefore, the corruption index is lower in these countries. Hence, therefore, Madam Speaker, effective monitoring and sanctions for non-compliance must be the order of the day if this law will gather the credibility, l'adhésion populaire. And there must be no flaws in verification. There must be sufficient supervision. There must be control with regards to the implementation of the declaration of assets. And this is how our country can win in this credibility gap that we have with regard to the perception of corruption in our country. In fact, Madam Speaker, we all know that according to the Transparency International, our index of corruption was 54 last year. It was 51 2 years ago. In our recent history, it's been to 33. So the perception of corruption, I have the figures with me, has gone up recently, and therefore this measure today hopefully will help to clear matters on that issue. Madam Speaker, there is no doubt to me that the next general elections, during the next general elections, the issue of corruption and ethics will be a major issue. This is why I think all the measures that have to be taken should be taken. We should stop with doubtful practices, like setting up private companies shrouded in opacity and the like, Madam Speaker. Let us take what is happening in this country. Government is talking of bringing in development, but at the same time we hear of the SIFB scandal. These are the issues, corruption issues, which are, as the French say, plomber l'action de ce gouvernement. Un pas devant, 10 pas derrière. And in spite of the efforts made, we see, Madam Speaker, that to the people, perhaps development is less important than integrity is more important than development of our infrastructure. This is why I think, and this is my personal wish, Madam Speaker, that our anti-corruption laws must be reviewed periodically. The fight against corruption can be won in this country, Madam Speaker, failing which this government will have to answer to the population in the next general elections. I have done. Thank you.